An American tourist insulted Britain's military legacy in front of a royal guard, thinking he'd remain silent. But one command shattered his arrogance, and what followed became a masterclass in shared history. Morning sunlight glinted off the ancient stones of the Tower of London as tourists began filtering through the gates. The early spring air carried a crisp bite, causing visitors to pull their jackets closer as they waited to enter the historic fortress. Among them stood Brad Thompson, dressed in a well-tailored business casual outfit, his bearing that of a successful executive used to being heard. "This is what people fly across an ocean for," Brad's voice carried across the courtyard, loud enough to make his 15-year-old daughter Emma sink deeper into her coat. "I mean, it's just some old rocks. Back home we'd have torn this down and built something useful by now." His wife Catherine quietly consulted their guidebook, pretending not to notice the disapproving glances from nearby British tourists. "Actually, honey, the tower has nearly 1,000 years of history. It says here, 1,000 years of collecting dust," Brad interrupted, with the confident dismissal of someone used to making million-dollar decisions. "You know what we built in the last 100 years while they were polishing these stones? Silicon Valley. Space rockets. The internet." He gestured expansively at the medieval walls. "But sure, let's all pretend this museum piece is still relevant." A group of Canadian tourists shuffled past, their guide speaking in hushed, reverent tones about the crown jewels. Brad's voice rose above the guide's historical commentary. "Emma, look at this. They're still showing off the crown jewels like it means something in today's world, symbols of an empire they couldn't keep." "Dad, please," Emma muttered, her cheeks burning red. She'd spent months looking forward to this trip, fascinated by British history. Now her father was turning it into another lecture about American superiority. More tourists were beginning to gather for the morning tours. A pair of elderly British veterans, their blazers adorned with service medals, made their way past the White Tower. Brad noticed their medals and scoffed. "See that, Emma? They're still playing dress-up, just like their guards. The whole country's stuck in the past." Catherine touched his arm gently. "Brad, maybe we should join one of the official tours. The yeoman warders are actually active duty." "You mean the guys in the costumes?" Brad said with the same tone he used for dismissing overvalued startup pitches. "This whole place is like a museum that forgot to evolve. Back home, we're making real history, not just preserving it." As they moved deeper into the courtyard, Brad's running commentary continued to draw attention. Some tourists simply walked faster to distance themselves from his voice. Others, particularly a well-dressed woman who proudly announced herself as being from Virginia, seemed encouraged by his behaviour, nodding along with his remarks. With that, Brad's attention fixed on the Royal Guard as their family rounded the corner of the White Tower. The guard stood perfectly still, ceremonial rifle positioned exactly, eyes focused straight ahead. Morning light glinted off the brass buttons of his immaculate uniform, each piece a testament to centuries of tradition. "Would you look at that?" Brad announced, loud enough for nearby tourists to turn. "They've got this guy standing here like a statue. In America, we've got our soldiers doing actual military work, not playing dress-up for tourists." Emma tried pulling at his sleeve. "Dad, they are real soldiers. I read that they—" "Come on, sweetie," Brad cut her off, moving closer to the guard. "This is what happens when a country can't let go of the past. They turn their military into a tourist attraction." He stood next to the guard, maintaining what he thought was a safe distance while speaking sideways toward him. "Must be pretty boring, huh? Standing here all day while the rest of the world moves forward?" A woman in her 50s wearing an American flag pin approached, nodding vigorously. "You've got that right," she called out. "My name's Karen, and I was just saying the same thing to my husband. All this pomp and ceremony, what's it really worth?" Catherine noticed a group of British citizens gathering nearby, including the two elderly veterans they'd seen earlier. Their faces had grown stern, but they maintained a dignified silence. She touched her husband's arm again. "Brad, maybe we should move along?" No, no, this is educational, Brad insisted, warming to his subject as Karen moved closer to show her support. See, Emma, this is what happens when you lose a war. You end up stuck in the past, playing pretend soldier instead of being a real world power. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the growing crowd. One of the veterans straightened his already perfect posture, campaign medals gleaming on his chest. But Brad, encouraged by Karen's enthusiastic nodding, continued his impromptu lecture. I mean, think about it, then while they're standing here guarding what? Some old rocks. American troops are out there leading the free world. When was the last time Britain did anything significant on the world stage? He gestured dismissively at the guard's ceremonial rifle. That thing probably isn't even loaded, probably isn't even real. Sir, a quiet but firm voice came from nearby. One of the elderly veterans had stepped forward, his bearing still military straight despite his age. You might want to reconsider. Oh, we've got another one, Brad laughed, turning to Karen. See, they've got the old-timers doing it too. The whole country's living in a museum. The guard remained motionless, but there was something in his bearing, a subtle shift in the air around him, that suggested gathering storm clouds. The crowd had grown larger now, with tourists from various nations watching the scene unfold. Many had expressions of dismay, while others seemed to be waiting for something they sensed was coming. Catherine tried one last time to intervene. Brad, you don't understand. These guards are active-duty military... Active duty what? Tourist photographers, Brad scoffed, his voice growing louder with each word. Let me tell you something about real military power. If it wasn't for America stepping in during World War II, Brad continued, his voice echoing off the ancient stones, this whole place would be speaking German right now. That's real military history, not this costume show. The elderly veteran's face tightened, his medals catching the morning light. Behind him, his companion placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. The growing crowd had fallen into a tense silence, broken only by Brad's increasingly confident pronouncements. You know what really gets me? Brad turned to address the onlookers directly. We came in and saved Europe, rebuilt everything through the Marshall Plan, became the world's greatest superpower, and they're still hanging on to this medieval pageantry like it means something. Karen moved closer, nodding enthusiastically. My grandfather fought in World War II, she announced proudly. And he used to say the same thing. The British Empire was finished after that war. America had to take over everything. The two veterans exchanged glances, years of military discipline evident in their controlled reactions. The older of the two touched his campaign medals unconsciously, decorations that, had Brad looked closer, showed service in conflicts where British and American forces had fought side by side. Dad, Emma's voice was barely a whisper now. In history class, we learned that Britain fought the Nazis for years before we had to come rescue them, exactly. Brad seized on his daughter's comment, completely missing her actual point. See, even our kids know the real story. We're the ones who... Excuse me, sir, a quiet voice interrupted. A young woman in civilian clothes stepped forward from the crowd. The set of her shoulders and her bearing marked her as military, even in casual dress. I'm a Technical Sergeant Chen, United States Air Force. Perhaps we should... See? Brad gestured triumphantly at the guard. Even our active duty personnel dress like normal people when they're not on duty. They're not stuck in the 18th century. The guard remained motionless, but there was a subtle change in the atmosphere. Those closest to him might have noticed his knuckles whitening slightly on his ceremonial rifle, though his face remained impassive. The thing about empires, Brad continued, warming to his theme, is that they all fall eventually. Rome fell, Britain fell, but America? He gestured expansively at the tower walls. We're still rising. While you guys are standing guard over old stones, we're planning missions to Mars. That's the difference between living in the past and building the future. The Canadian family who'd been nearby earlier began to edge away, the parents shooting apologetic glances at the British veterans. A group of Australian tourists watched with obvious discomfort, while several British citizens had stopped to stare in disbelief. And another thing about World War II, Brad raised his voice even louder, encouraged by Karen's vigorous nodding. We didn't just save Britain. We had to save their whole empire. Then they lost it anyway because they couldn't. Young man, the elderly veteran finally spoke up again, his voice carrying the weight of years of service. You might want to consider. Consider what? Brad turned, his face flushed with the momentum of his own rhetoric. Consider that while we were building the modern world, you folks were busy losing colonies and playing dress-up with your remaining soldiers. I mean, look at this guy. He gestured toward the guard. In America, we have our military focused on actual defence, not tourist attractions. When's the last time a British soldier did anything besides stand still and look pretty? The crowd had grown larger now, and the atmosphere had become charged with tension. Catherine had given up trying to intervene, standing back with one arm around Emma's shoulders. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting stark shadows across the courtyard as Brad continued his impromptu lecture. His voice had taken on the same authoritative tone he used in board meetings, each word delivered with the conviction of someone unused to being challenged. Let me explain something about military efficiency, he announced, addressing the growing crowd as if they were shareholders at an annual meeting. In the corporate world, we call this kind of operation outdated infrastructure. You've got highly trained personnel standing guard over, what exactly? Ancient stones and ceremonial jewellery. The elderly veteran stepped forward again, his campaign medals glinting in the sunlight. Young man, I served alongside American forces in... Exactly my point, Brad cut him off with a dismissive wave. You're all living off past glory. Britain was a great power once, sure, but today you're a tourist attraction, a theme park for people who can't let go of the past. He turned to the guard, his voice taking on a patronising edge. No offence to you personally, but this is exactly what I'm talking about. In America, our military bases look like something from the future. Meanwhile, you're still dressed like it's 1750. The woman from Virginia nodded emphatically. I work in defence contracting, she added, and he's absolutely right. We spend billions on modernisation while they're polishing brass buttons and changing the guard. Catherine's hand tightened on Emma's shoulder as she noticed several tour groups stopping to watch. The yeoman warder leading them had fallen silent, his usual historical commentary forgotten as the scene unfolded. You want to know the real difference? Brad continued, warming to his theme like he was delivering a keynote speech. When America projects power, we do it with aircraft carriers and stealth technology. When Britain tries to show authority, they wheel out carriages and crown jewels. He gestured at the guard's ceremonial rifle. I mean, look at this setup. In the time it takes you to perform one changing of the guard ceremony, our rapid deployment forces could be halfway across the world. The tension in the courtyard had become palpable. The Australian tourists had stopped pretending not to listen, and a group of international visitors watched with expressions ranging from embarrassment to disbelief. Technical Sergeant Chen had moved closer to the veterans, her posture reflecting barely contained disagreement. Dad, Emma tried one last time. In history class, we learned about NATO and how Britain and America are actually... NATO? Brad laughed. The same laugh he used when junior executives made naive proposals. Honey, NATO is just a fancy way of saying America handles everyone's defence while they spend their money on maintaining... He waved his hand at the tower walls. All this. You know what the British military budget would buy in Silicon Valley? Maybe one decent start-up. The guard remained motionless, but there was something in his bearing now, a subtle tension visible to those who knew what to look for. The elderly veteran had straightened to his full height, his own military bearing returning despite his age. And here's what really gets me, Brad said, his voice rising with absolute certainty. We saved this country in World War II, rebuilt Europe with our own money, and what thanks do we get? They stand here pretending they're still a world power, acting like their ceremonial guards are somehow equivalent to real military force. I've got more security at my office building than... The guard's ceremonial rifle snapped to attention with a crack that echoed off the ancient stones, causing several tourists to jump. In one fluid motion, he turned his head to face Brad directly, military bearing transforming from ceremonial to commanding in an instant. The morning air seemed to crackle with sudden tension. "Since you're so invested in discussing military history," the guard's voice carried the steel of active combat experience, his eyes locked onto Brad's with unflinching intensity, "allow me to educate you on the reality of British military power." The crowd fell absolutely silent. Even the woman from Virginia took an instinctive step backward, the guard's shift from ceremonial statue to commanding presence catching everyone off guard. Catherine drew Emma closer, watching as her husband, for the first time that morning, seemed at a loss for words. There was nothing ceremonial about the guard now. His bearing spoke of modern military authority, combat experience evident in every line of his posture. This wasn't a man playing at soldier. This was a warrior momentarily dispensing with ceremony to address ignorance. "First, let's address your World War II narrative." His eyes hadn't left Brad's face, and there was nothing ceremonial in his bearing now. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany from 1939 to 1941, fighting across land, sea and air, while America remained neutral. For 2 years, we were the only thing standing between Hitler and complete European domination. Brad opened his mouth, but for once no words came out. The guard continued, his voice carrying the weight of historical fact, backed by military precision. "You mentioned the Marshall Plan. Let me refresh your memory about what preceded it. During those 2 years of standing alone, Britain liquidated every foreign asset, sold every overseas investment, and emptied our treasury to fund the war effort. We bankrupted ourselves deliberately, sacrificing our empire's wealth to hold the line against fascism." The elderly veteran nodded grimly, his campaign medals glinting. The guard acknowledged him with a slight inclination of his head before continuing. "When America joined the war after Pearl Harbor, and make no mistake, we welcomed your arrival with open arms. It wasn't to save us. It was to join an alliance that had already been bleeding and fighting for years. The Soviets had lost millions. The French resistance had been dying in the shadows. The Polish had been fighting since 1939. The guard's posture shifted subtly, modern military bearing becoming even more evident. "You mentioned our current military capabilities. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan alongside American forces. I have trained with US Special Forces, participated in joint NATO exercises, and earned my combat medals, fighting the same enemies as your troops." His voice took on an edge of steel. "While you were observing our ceremonial duties from your tourist's vantage point, British forces were deployed in counter-terrorism operations across the globe. The same soldiers you see performing ceremonial duties here have fought in Iraq, Afghanistan, and classified operations you'll never hear about." Technical Sergeant Chen stepped forward, nodding in confirmation. "Sir, he's right. I've worked with British SAS and RAF units. Their capabilities are beyond what civilians are cleared to know," the guard cut in smoothly. "Now, about your comment regarding modern military bases." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I could tell you about RAF Fylingdales' ballistic missile warning system, or the nuclear submarine bases in Scotland, or our cyber warfare divisions. But those aren't the kind of facilities we advertise to tourists." Brad's confident demeanour had completely evaporated. The guard wasn't finished. "This uniform, which you so casually dismissed, represents both tradition and active service. Every guard you see here has earned their place through modern combat deployment and specialised training. We honour our history precisely because we're still making it." He gestured to the veterans' medals. "Those decorations aren't from World War II, sir. They're from Korea, where British and American forces fought and died together, just as we did in every major conflict since. The special relationship between our nations was forged in shared sacrifice, mutual respect, and a common cause." The guard's voice softened slightly, though his bearing remained razor-sharp. We're not a theme park, sir. We're one of America's closest military allies, with nuclear capabilities, a permanent UN Security Council seat, and special forces that work so closely with yours that the enemies of freedom can't tell us apart. The morning sun caught his brass buttons as he concluded, "That's the reality of British military power, not a relic of the past, but a crucial part of the modern Western alliance." Now, would you like to learn about the actual history of this tower, or shall we continue discussing current military capabilities? The silence that followed the guard's words hung heavy in the morning air. Brad stood motionless, his earlier corporate confidence stripped away by the precision of military fact. The woman from Virginia had retreated into the crowd, her previous nodding approval replaced by quiet discomfort. The elderly veteran stepped forward, his bearing matching the guard's military precision. "If I may add, sir," he addressed Brad with formal courtesy that somehow cut deeper than anger, "I served in the Falklands alongside American intelligence units. My colleague here," he gestured to his companion, "was part of the First Gulf War Coalition. While you were forming opinions about our military from tourist photos, we were building the modern framework of international defense cooperation." Technical Sergeant Chen moved to stand beside the veteran. "Our commanding officer in my last deployment was Royal Marines. He led a joint task force that included US, British and NATO forces. Sir," she addressed Brad directly, "the capabilities of British Special Forces are considered equal to anything we field." Catherine touched her husband's arm, but this time not to restrain him. "Brad," she said quietly, "my grandfather served in the RAF during those 2 years the Guard mentioned, before America entered the war. That's why—" she paused, "that's why I was hoping this trip would help you understand." Emma, who had been silent throughout the Guard's response, finally spoke up. "Dad, in history class, we learned about the Ultra program, how British codebreakers cracked the Nazi encryption. They shared everything with American forces when they joined the war. We wouldn't have won without each other." The Guard remained in his authoritative stance, but his voice carried a tone of professional respect as he addressed the gathering crowd. "The strength of our alliance lies not in comparing victories, but in understanding how they were achieved together. Your Pentagon and our Ministry of Defense share operational capabilities that I'm not at liberty to discuss. But I can tell you this. When American and British forces deploy together, our enemies don't see two separate nations. They see the combined strength of Western military power." Brad's hand moved unconsciously to straighten his tie, a boardroom habit that now seemed oddly out of place. "I appear to have spoken from a position of inadequate information," he said, his business vocabulary failing to fully mask his genuine realization. The Guard's parade ground posture returned, his bearing shifting seamlessly back to ceremonial duty. But there was a different atmosphere in the courtyard now, one of restored dignity and mutual respect. The morning sun had fully cleared the tower walls, casting long shadows across the ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of shared history. The woman from Virginia had already departed, quietly melting into the crowd. A yeoman warder approached, his traditional uniform carrying new weight after the morning's history lesson. "Perhaps, sir," he addressed Brad with professional courtesy, "you'd be interested in learning about the tower's role in modern military ceremonies? Many of your own military traditions trace their roots to these grounds." Brad straightened, adopting the posture of a man who had learned to reassess his positions. "I believe," he said, glancing at his family, "we would all benefit from that knowledge." His voice carried the humility of an executive who had encountered data that completely reversed his analysis. Emma stepped closer to the Guard, her earlier embarrassment replaced by genuine curiosity. "Is it true that the tower still houses active military command facilities?" "That information," the Guard replied with the faintest hint of a professional smile, "remains classified." The elderly veterans nodded in approval before departing, their bearing matching the Guard's military precision. Technical Sergeant Chen exchanged a respectful nod with the guard, the subtle acknowledgement between professional warriors, requiring no words. As the Thompson family followed the yeoman warder to begin their proper tour, the guard resumed his watch. The Tower of London stood as it had for centuries, its stones bearing witness to yet another lesson in the enduring alliance between two great nations. An alliance forged not in competition, but in shared sacrifice and mutual respect. What do you think about this encounter between the American tourist and the Royal Guard? More importantly, what other misconceptions about these elite soldiers need to be addressed? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, hit subscribe for more stories that remind us why alliances matter. See you in the next one.